So, conducting an interview, journalism, I'm Mr. Karle. Welcome. So if we're talking about conducting an interview, there's sort of, you're going to need to interview people for your written articles, right? So some of this, conducting an interview, blends with if we were doing a newscast, right? So if you were out doing, a story that you were later going to air for people to view. But the same basic tenets for conducting an interview apply no matter what you're doing. So here we go. Obviously, while we're watching, we're pulling out 10 to 15 details you think are important for you to remember when you conduct an interview. So these are the things that should stand out to you as while you watch this. Then you'll bring that in for class tomorrow. We'll discuss it. So while you're watching this video, what does Katie Couric suggest about interviewing? Right. So we're going to watch this video quickly and just jot down some notes about what you think she's telling you about interviewing. It's a little bit broken up at first, but bear with me.
Hey YouTube, I'm Tony Masilis. I'm a producer here at the CBS Evening News, and I have the pleasure of working with Katie Couric on a very regular basis.
Pleasure.
It's a pleasure. And you're obviously known for your interview skills. So there's this new channel at YouTube called the Reporter Center, and they wanted us to just ask you a few questions about what makes a good interview.
Okay.
So maybe the first question would be, what makes somebody a good interviewer?
Well, I think it's really important, Tony, to be a gracious host, because I think the more comfortable you make someone feel, the better interview you'll ultimately get. So I know that in terms of body language, I always try to be very warm and welcoming, and I think it's really critical to put someone at ease. I think also you have to calibrate your tone depending on what interview you're doing. If I'm talking to David Duke about, anti-Semitism or racism, obviously I'll have a very different tone. I'll be much more pugnacious than I would be when I'm talking to someone who may have suffered a personal tragedy. So I think it's really important to be very empathetic in some cases, and then to know when you're going to be loaded for bear and really try to elicit important information from someone who may be a bit oily and not direct in answering your questions.
How do you prepare for an interview?
Well, I try to do a combination of explaining what I can in the body of the question without going on and on. And I try to ask questions, obviously, that don't require a yes or no answer, because that's a disaster, because you're left kind of with a lot of dead air. And depending on who I'm talking to, I fashion my questions that way. And I sometimes go through them and think, well, how is this person likely to answer this? And what would be an appropriate follow-up? And knowing what they've said in previous interviews or their positions on various issues, I think, well, how can I go at this another way? Sometimes it happens spontaneously, obviously, when someone doesn't answer your questions, but at other times I think you can predict appropriate follow-up questions.
It might sound a little bit Captain Obvious, but listening is probably really important, right?
Very, very. Nothing is worse for me than as a viewer to watch someone go down a laundry list of questions and not explore something with a little more depth after someone has answered a question already. To not pick up on something, maybe an inconsistency or something that may be news, and follow up on that and use that as the springboard to go into a whole different area. I think you need to use your questions as sort of a template, but you have to be willing to listen, as you said, Tony, and really veer off in a totally different direction. I can't stand it when people don't have the ability to do that. I'm like, it makes me crazy.
Now, that being said, have you ever had an interview go pretty far south on you where you're sitting there like, what do I do now?
Yeah, well, it is hard. Sometimes people freeze. Sometimes they're just cranky. I had an actor who I interviewed, who shall remain nameless, who just didn't want to be bothered. It really annoyed me because I was giving him a lot of time on national television and he clearly didn't want to be there. But one member of the Flying Walendas, I know, why was I interviewing them? This woman answered every question with a monosyllabic answer, and it was very frustrating to kind of get her to elaborate. And then Bobcat Goldthwait, the comedian, I sort of missed the memo that he screamed, so I kept asking him, "Why are you yelling at me?" And I didn't realize stupidly that that was part of his shtick. That was
Did you know who he was?
really embarrassing. I kind of knew a little bit about who he was. Now I certainly know all about him.
Oh, well, I'm sure you do the hard way, right?
Yeah,
You learned about
exactly,
Bobcat.
exactly.
Any last minute tips that you want to give to people? Anything that anybody starting out in the business might want to know?
Well, I think you should remember who you're serving, your audience. You're trying to inform them, you're trying to illuminate a certain subject, enlighten people, and I think you need to keep that in mind. This isn't a self-aggrandizing exercise about how much you know. It's not an opportunity for a gotcha moment. I think it's really to shed some light on how someone thinks and their position, and to allow them to communicate. And I think if you allow your interview subject to communicate whatever message he or she might have at that moment, then you've done an effective job.
Thank you so much, Katie. It's time for me to get back to the other side of the camera where I belong.
I like you here, Tony.
Oh, well,
Come
okay.
on.
It feels pretty good.
All right, so you got some ideas from her, right? Types of questions to ask, what not to ask. Make sure that you have follow-up questions, and then know who you're talking to. So we're going to see some examples about those things. So things to consider before you interview. What questions will you ask? Where will the interview be, right? You don't want to grab someone. So this is, obviously if we're doing it for, if we're doing it for a video that someone's going to watch later, you want to set it up in a place where people feel comfortable, but also that it looks professional, whatever. But the other thing is, if you're interviewing someone just for an article for the newspaper, is it something you can set up beforehand? Are you going to go to their office? Are you going to have them come somewhere else to talk to you? Are you going to grab them on the way through the school, right? So if you're talking to the principal, that might be hard to do. They're often going somewhere and they're busy. So, thinking, I'll just grab them and talk to them in the hallway. It might be loud. You might lose focus. One of those things. And then how will you take notes? So things to consider. Are you going to jot down all the words they say? If you want direct quotes, are you going to record them? Then you have to let them know that you're recording. So how are you going to do it? How do you plan on getting down the information that they share with you? And then what will you do to overcome your nerves, right? Because you're talking to people that might be a lot older or experts on a subject, or people that might not want to talk to you. Maybe they don't like your position, but they're willing to talk to you to get their position across. Or someone that has power over you, right? I could, if you had to interview someone who, for example, in our school, if you interviewed a teacher or a principal or the superintendent, right? How are you going to overcome those nerves? Why conduct interviews for stories, right? So we're talking about writing a news story. Why interview, right? I can get all the information, right? Can I get all the information from YouTube, Wikipedia, Google? Can I Google information? So what does an interview have that the internet doesn't have? And that's a question that we'll answer. So why interview? Why not just do all your research outside of interviews? So think about it like this. You have a face-to-face interview versus a Google search. Interviews add emotions to the facts, right? So you as the reporter are giving me the facts. If you interview someone, then you can bring in someone's emotions, right? Someone who's involved with the story, you can bring in their emotions. So they give you quotes that offer the part of the story you, as the reporter, cannot tell through the facts, right? The personal part. So if you're talking to someone who, well, you can tell me all about the fire, but if you are talking to the person whose house burned down, then that's the emotion. You can't give me the emotion, but those quotes can give me the emotion, right? Because then you bring in personal bias. But if you talk to someone, hey, here's what happened. This house burned down, and then you talk to the person and they tell you all about what they lost or how long they've been living in the house or where are they going to go or what are those things. that you can't add as just the reporter. So you as the reporter give the facts, the interview quotes, they offer the emotion. So an interview is a common form of a primary source, right? I'm going to someone, I'm talking to them, they're the person. Now I can go back and I can write my article and I can quote them, and those are the facts, right? An alternative source of information. So you can go out and you can pour over all the information that you want, and then here's another form of information straight from someone who observed it, right? Purposeful face-to-face encounter. It's always different when you're talking to someone face-to-face to get the information from them. But you have to take steps before you interview. So it's as effective as possible. You might be grabbing someone for 10, 15, 20 minutes, or at the end of a game, you're going to interview someone and you might only have a couple minutes. So what kind of interview? So you got to take these steps before you start to interview. Pre-interview stage, determine the purpose of the interview. Am I going to get this person to give me insider information that no one else would have? Am I going to ask them to elaborate on something that they said before? What's the purpose in the information? Then the other thing is you want to research the topic. So before you even get to the interview, you want to know about the topic that you're talking about, because you don't want to go and take someone's time who's an expert on a subject and then basically tell them, I don't respect you enough to know what I'm asking you about. Right? Next thing is choose your interviewee. Who are you interviewing? Right? So if you want, if you want to get the strongest information, do an eyewitness of something? Do you interview an expert at it? So say, for example, if we go back to the fire example, do we interview the fire chief? Do we interview a police officer? Do we interview the neighbor? Do we interview the person whose house burned down? So those are all the people who make that list of who you want to interview. If you can only grab one person to interview, who is that one person? Right? Something that happens in the school. Do I interview the principal? Do I interview a teacher? Who do I interview? Prepare for the interview. Know who you are talking to and what you are talking about. So if we look at this interview here, right, this is big time. You want to, again, you don't want to seem like someone who's not paying attention to the story that they're writing. So you need to know who you're talking to, what you're talking about. So here in this interview, look what happens very quickly.
Lasted how long?
9 years, 180 episodes.
You gave it up, right?
I did.
So they didn't cancel you. You canceled them.
You're not aware of this?
No, I'm asking you.
You think I got canceled? Are you under the impression that I got canceled?
I've heard you, Jerry.
I thought that was pretty well documented. Is this still CNN? I was the #1 show on television, Larry.
You were
Do you know who I am?
Jewish guy, Brooklyn.
Yes.
Okay.
75 million viewers. Last episode.
Boy, don't take it so bad.
Well, that's the big difference between being canceled and being #1.
Okay, I'm sorry. We'll be right back.
Jeez.
B-movie opens. B-movie
Can we get a
opens.
resume in here for me?
B-movie opens
Larry,
tomorrow.
come over.
We'll be right back.
So you can see, if that happens to you, obviously if we're doing broadcast journalism and that happens to you on camera and it's live, that's incredibly embarrassing, right? Larry King should know who he's interviewing. I mean, he's interviewing Jerry Seinfeld. I think it's like he had the longest running sitcom, right? So he should know who he's talking to, and then what he's talking about. Obviously, if we're doing print journalism, you can still get into that situation, right, where you upset your interviewee and they don't want to talk to you anymore, right? Do you know who you're talking to? Do you know what you're talking about? Why are you asking me that question? You're wasting my time. Interview over, and then they leave, or they don't give you any more useful information. So this is a respect thing to know who you're talking to and what you're talking about. So then once you've set the stage, what's the interview proper? The opening. This is where the tone of the interview is set, right? So you want to sort of make someone comfortable. The more comfortable someone is with talking to you, the more that they're going to say, right? And that's the purpose in an interview, is to get them to expand on ideas or things that you've asked them, right? So set the tone. Don't go in, even if you're going to sort of press them on issues, don't go in right off the bat and be aggressive, right? That can always happen a little bit later. You can press them with with follow-up questions, so on and so forth, but you're setting the tone of the interview. On camera, this can all be done though too. I think a good thing to think of right now is to pause and think about body language, right? If I'm looking at someone, if I'm engaged, if I'm nodding, if they lean in, I can lean in. If they smile, I can smile, and reflecting their movements to a certain degree helps them feel more comfortable and more open. So that's a good thing to do right from the start, right? Next thing is the body of the interview. This is the main part of the interview where you ask the question. So you've introduced yourself, you've made them feel comfortable, then you start asking the questions, right? You make sure that they're ready to answer and they understand what's happening. Also, you want to tell them that you're going to use their quotes. If you're writing for an article for the newspaper, you want to tell them you're going to use their quotes directly. We've had a couple issues with that. All right. So, but this is the main part of the interview where you start to ask the questions. Start off with questions that they feel comfortable answering. The more successful they feel answering the questions, the harder questions you can ask, because then they'll feel like they've already been successful. And then we go on. Closing. It leaves the interviewee with a positive feeling about the constructive outcome of the interview, right? So you want to leave them feeling like, oh, that was a good interview, and I feel like I've represented myself well, and I'm represented well. It shows appreciation and courtesy to your interviewee, and it provides a summary statement. So obviously the summary statement part is more for broadcast journalism, but all the same, right? You want to leave the room after you've interviewed someone for your article with them feeling very positive, because then they'll feel positive about the article and you won't have any further issues. If we're doing broadcast journalism, all these apply, and then you have some sort of summary statement where you leave with the interviewer. So the post-interview stage when using the information. So things to consider. Who is the intended audience, right? So who am I writing this for? Is it people who are experts at something, right? If you're writing about science and you're writing it for a scientific journal, then you can write it in a certain way. If you're writing about science and you're writing for people who've never, or you're writing for a broad audience, some people might be experts, some people might not know anything. Who's your audience, right? And then how can I best convey the information? So that also determines on how you present your information. What format do you present your information in? So could I do something like this with it? Having interviewed the owner of the Cafe Royale, she confirmed that 55% of her drinks sold were coffee. Teas accounted for 25% and 15% were made up of juices. The remaining 5% is made up of various other drinks. So that's one way to capture the information, right? I can write it out. So that could come from the article. The other way to do it would be to put it in a graph form, right? So 55% comes from coffee, this percentage comes from tea, juices, and then other. Do I present it this way? So it just depends on how much space you have or how you want to present your information. Do you want to write a lot of facts and figures and numbers? People may not pay as much attention to those written out as they might a visual. So it just depends on, hey, I got all this great information, how do I convey it to my readers? This is super important. Types of questions. There's two types of questions, essentially, to begin with, and then we'll get into the other types of questions. But open-ended questions. These are questions that you ask someone and then that they can elaborate on. It's not a one-word answer. How did you get this? How did you get started in this business? Okay, that's open-ended. Then they give you a story. It's great for your interview. How would you describe your dream job? Right? If you said, "What's your dream job?" they could say, "Shoveling ditches." right? How would you describe it is more, it offers more room for them to describe what about shoveling ditches, right? That's open-ended. These are the types of questions you want to shoot for. Close-ended questions, right? How many languages do you speak? The answer? 7. What? Can you expand on that, right? Then you have to follow up with a question, and if you're doing broadcast journalism, asking a question, then asking them to clarify, then asking them to clarify, seems unprofessional and also annoys the people, right? Do you come from a big family? Yes. So try to avoid closed-ended questions, right? You'll see why in this interview. So we can watch just a little bit of it at first. If you want to watch it later, that's up to you. But to begin with, watch what happens in this.
Sigur Rós is Jon Bergersen on guitars and vocals, Kjartan Svensson on keyboards, Orri Pál Djarsson on drums, and Georg Holm on bass. How did I do with those names, guys?
Pretty good.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you start out playing this kind of music, or did you start out as a more, people might think, regular sounding band, and then did you kind of go here as you experimented?
I don't know. I think we probably just started out playing like this.
I mean, what was the first time that you guys sat down with your instruments and started playing? Did you have this thought, we want to create this very specific kind of music? Because the stuff that you make doesn't sound like a lot of other stuff that's out there. Or did you get to that right away?
Yeah, I think we probably did. Don't think we didn't sit down and talk about, we want to play this type of music or something. It was just happened naturally.
And how do you guys create a song?
We just sit down and create this one.
Does one person start playing one instrument and then everyone else starts to kind of add into that?
Yeah, kind of.
All right, so you can see there, right? Lots of closed-ended questions. Did you guys start playing this way, or did it take long? Yes, we started playing this way. Boring, right? This is radio too. Like if you think about this is radio, and people are listening to it, you can't even watch these guys talking. All you're hearing is this what you did? Yes. Oh, well, what did you do then? Did you do this? Yes. Right. So very quickly you see the problem with that kind of an interview. So think about your questions. Are you asking open-ended questions? You can ask closed-ended questions, but only if you need a particular yes or no answer for a particular question. But otherwise, open-ended questions allow them to talk, and then you might get more of the story. So let's see. Oh, there we are. Whoops. Oh boy. That's not going to do us any good. Here we go. So, primary question. This is the questions that you're asking first, right? What makes digital photography fascinating for you? How did you make this shift from traditional film-based photography to digital photography? So those are primary questions. Have them answer the question that you want them to answer, and then think about secondary or follow-up questions. Can you ask them to clarify something? Did you say poorer or purer? Right, so that's something you need to clarify. That's a clarifying secondary question. If you ask a closed-ended question, you can follow up with something like, "Can you give me an example of that?" Right? That way, you're getting you're coming across. You're not coming across as though you don't know what you're asking, but you're asking them to give you more information in a way that that seems purposeful, right? Always think of secondary questions or follow-up questions to ask. Let's see. So, if we watch this, there's open-ended questions, there's secondary questions, and there's follow-up questions. There's all kinds of things. We'll watch a little bit of this this interview and see how it works. Also, pay attention though to the interviewer's body language. I think that his body language might convey frustration or sort of You know, he's sort of not as interested in. He's looking to, I think, trip up the interviewee.
Russell Brand, who are you to edit a political magazine?
Well, I suppose like a person who's being politely asked by an attractive woman. I don't know what the typical criteria is. I don't know many people that edit political magazines. Boris, he used to do one, didn't he? So I'm a person with crazy hair, quite a good sense of humour, don't know much about politics, I'm ideal.
But is it true you don't even vote?
Yeah, no, I don't vote.
Well, how do you have any authority to talk about politics then?
Well, I don't get my authority from this pre-existing paradigm, which is quite narrow and only serves a few people. I look elsewhere for alternatives that might be of service to humanity. Alternate means, alternate political systems.
They being?
Well, I've not invented it yet, Jeremy. I had to do a magazine last week. I've had a lot on my plate. But I say, but here's the thing it shouldn't do. Shouldn't destroy the planet. Shouldn't create massive economic disparity. Shouldn't ignore the needs of the people. The burden of proof is on the people with the power, not people like doing a magazine.
How do you imagine that people get power?
Well, I imagine there are sort of hierarchical systems that have been preserved through
They get power
generations.
by being voted in.
Well, you
That's
say
how
that,
they
Jeremy,
do it.
but
You
like-
can't even be asked to vote.
It's quite a narrow prescriptive parameter that changes within the
In a democracy, that's how it works.
Well, I don't think it's working very well, Jeremy, given that the planet is being destroyed, given that there is economic disparity of a huge degree. What you're saying, there's no alternative. There's no alternative.
No, I'm not
just this
saying
system.
that. I'm saying if you
Brilliant.
can't be asked to vote, why should we be asked to listen to your political point of view?
You don't have to listen to my political point of view, but it's not that I'm not voting out of apathy. I'm not voting out of absolute indifference and weariness and exhaustion from the lies, treachery, deceit of the political class that has been going on for generations now, and which has now reached fever pitch where we have a disenfranchised, disillusioned, despondent underclass that are not being represented by that political system. So voting for it is tacit complicity with that system, and that's not something I'm offering up.
Well, why do you change it then?
I'm trying to.
Well, why don't you start by voting?
I don't think it works. People have voted already, and that's what's created the current paradigm.
When did you last vote?
Never.
You never ever vote.
No, do you think that's really bad?
So you struck an attitude, what, before the age of 18?
Well, I was busy being a drug addict at that point because I come from the kind of social conditions that are exacerbated by an indifferent system that really just administrates for large corporations and ignores the population that it was voted in to serve.
You're blaming the political class for the fact that you had a drug problem?
No. I'm saying I was part of a social and economic class.
All right, so incredibly interesting interview. I think at times when the interviewer leans in and seems interested, that's good. I think when he starts pointing his finger and being a little bit more aggressive, I mean, it drives Russell Brand to really sort of answer the questions and clarify his points. It's a little bit maybe aggressive at times. But you see, he let him say something, then he had a follow-up question. He let the interview, like Katie Couric spoke about in the beginning, he let the interview go, and then he thought on his feet about questions that he would continue to ask, or or ask to probe the question further instead of just leaving it dead. Another good thing about interviews, or another thing to think about with interviews, is that sometimes the best thing to do is to say nothing at all and let the person talk. And then people hate silence, so they'll fill that silence with more information. So if you ask a question and you just sit there, they'll talk, even if it takes a little while. This is a good interview.
If you splice the genes of Sir David Attenborough with those of the cartoon Tasmanian Devil, you come up with something like my first guest, an Australian conservationist whose high decibel, over-the-top personality has made him, with 200 million viewers in 35 countries, count them, perhaps the most famous Australian in the world today, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, Steve Irwin. Steve Irwin, I'm looking forward to this. This is going to be a lot of fun.
It will be. I'm on fire, mate, so let's get into it.
We're already at the red level for energy. We haven't got to the first question. The Australia Zoo, which is now Steve Irwin Central up there on the Sunshine Coast.
Yeah, mate, that's where my heart beats from.
Now, this was started by your mum and dad back in the 70s, and it was hard, wasn't it? your mum, it was so hard sometimes your mum would cry. What was so tough?
Well, mate, it was 1970 and Dad was a plumber, really well-to-do plumber. He did really well in Melbourne, but he gave it all away to follow his passion, which was reptiles. And Mum was a maternity nurse who actually wanted to follow her passion, which was joey kangaroos and koalas and wombats and platypus, raising them. You know, they'd get hit by cars all the time. So together they started the Biwa Reptile Park in 1970. And it was tough times. We're on the main highway, like the Bruce Highway, but it was the Biwa Reptile Park, and at that stage, you know, snakes were something you hit with a stick.
Yeah.
You know, crocodiles were just evil, ugly monsters that kill people.
Yeah.
And koalas and kangaroos made, you know, great fur coats.
Yeah.
So it was hard times.
It's not a bad barbecue either.
Oh. Lucky enough, we're putting our foot on that kind of attitude.
Yeah,
But,
no, that was wrong.
and it was, you know, tourism. Exactly. And I'm bigger than you, mate.
Yeah.
Hey, tourism.
This could be a bad interview if you actually wrestle me to the ground and tie.
Should we do that?
Tell you what. Let's get a bit further in and then we'll see how we go, all right?
Yeah.
Because if we're going to do it, I want to oil up first. No.
But seriously, tourism was, you know, it was in its infancy back then, and it was so tough that Dad had to go fishing on the sideline. He had to grow strawberries and capsicums to actually support his passion, which was his wildlife facility.
Yeah. You grew up with the animals, they were your playmates, weren't they?
Absolutely, absolutely, Andrew. You know, like in my house when I was growing up, Mum would have 12 pouches, you know, make-believe kangaroo pouches set up on the backs of chairs, just virtually everywhere. So we'd have 12 little joeys ranging from little pinkies all the way up to 1-year-olds.
All right, so you can see that that interviewer just needed to start him going and not say very much after that. In fact, I think that when he made the joke about kangaroo barbecue, it was because he felt like he needed to say something, maybe because he wanted to say something, but not because Steve Irwin's interview was flagging at all. He was going to keep talking. That's also, I mean, obviously for broadcast journalism, that's interesting and important. However, for print journalism, that's also important because he's just talking. That's all information that you can get from him, and you can go back or from your interviewee. You can go back and you can look at it and you can see what they said and you can see what's useful, or you can see if it changes the direction of your story, but they're talking. And so you're developing information, you're developing facts, and maybe it's something that drives the conversation. Do not lose focus though. While they're talking, pay close attention to what they're saying, even if you're recording what they're saying with their permission. Pay attention to what they're saying, because there might be a moment where you say, oh, I've got to ask a question here. This is something I need to follow. Maybe there's something they said that I don't know about or I haven't heard about or needs more explanation. And at that moment, then you jot the question down, or you take a moment and you record that question, or you ask the question and have them go in that direction. You can say, I just want to ask you about something you just said. Can you clarify? And then have them go in that direction. Because at that point, maybe you're not in as much control of the interview that you thought. You're not going to get through all your questions, but that's okay if this is very interesting to pursue, and it might change the direction of the story. So that's basically conducting an interview. So think about what kind of questions you want to ask, who you're going to interview, what purpose you're going to interview, where you're going to do the interview, and what direction you want to go in. Make sure you've got open-ended questions. Make sure you've got follow-up questions, secondary, primary questions. Know when to ask more questions. Know when to let the interviewee speak, and then know how you're going to capture all that information. So, thank you.